At the end of the 15th century, Europe was consumed by an itch that began as a slight irritation in the lower region and soon turned into an unpleasant pain that could be felt in joints throughout the body. This often led to inflammation of the skin, horrible crusts, bumps, and in the worst case, the flesh could simply fall out of the body, leaving the patient terribly disfigured and even killing many. As this new mysterious disease swept the continent, the disease quickly became known as the French disease. For many, although the Russians decided to call it the Polish disease, the Dutch lived in the Spanish disease, the French called it, everyone blamed everyone else, and its rapid spread across Europe showed how closely linked Europeans were to each other. This was the first major outbreak of a sexually transmitted disease, and today we call it syphilis, often referred to as the great imitator due to its insidious resemblance to countless other diseases. Syphilis began to plague Europe in the late 15th century, and no one ever really stopped it. It is a disease that still kills about 100,000 people every year. Although with modern medicine, especially penicillin, it is not uncommon for Moderna. This number is much lower than it could be, but also higher than it really should be, which we will see later in today's video. Syphilis is an unpleasant disease, often transmitted through unprotected sex, but it can also be transmitted from mother to baby through what is called congenital syphilis. It is more common. Route transmission and development involves 4 different stages that occur one after the other if left untreated: primary, secondary, latent, and tertiary. If you are going to contract syphilis, it is best to keep it in the primary stage, where a generally painless sore usually appears on the body, usually on the penis or around the vagina. This typically occurs between 10 days and 90 days after exposure and can last 3 to 6 weeks before disappearing with or without treatment for those in the Moderna era who receive treatment, which is often the end of the syphilis adventure. However, for those who do not receive treatment, or for the millions who suffer from the disease before effective treatments, this is only the beginning of a very uncomfortable road ahead. The secondary stage overlaps the first and involves rashes that appear between 2 and 8 weeks after the primary stage appears, along with a wide variety of possible symptoms such as fever, sore throat, feeling weak in the body, and weight loss. After about 2 months, the rashes usually disappear, although the patient still remains highly contagious. The latent stage does not essentially involve visible signs that the patient is suffering from syphilis and is also known as the hidden stage, which can last from 1 to 20 years, and the disease remains active at every step along the way. The final and by far most destructive stage of syphilis is the tertiary stage, which can be divided into 3 gemata, which are large wounds inside the body or on the skin: cardiovascular syphilis, which affects the heart and blood vessels, and neurosyphilis, which affects the nervous system. Nervous. The good news for those who reach this high peak of syphilis is that it is no longer contagious. The bad news is that parts of your face may fall off and you may well die, for syphilis has varied widely throughout history, with numbers ranging from 8% to 58 years, with men in general more likely to die than women. There are debates surrounding the origin of syphilis, but these arguments are typically divided into 2 theories: the Columbian theory and the pre-Columbian theory. The Columbian theory suggests that syphilis was transported to Europe by members of Christopher Columbus' crew after returning from the New World. The Columbian exchange was a term used to describe the huge exchange of goods, animals, plants, food, metals, people, and culture that began in the 15th century between Europe and the Americas as we know. Part of this exchange also included numerous diseases that devastated the Americas, including smallpox, bubonic plague, chicken pox, cholera, the common cold, diphtheria, influenza, malaria, measles, scallop, even typhoid fever, typhus, and tuberculosis. Deep breathing. It was a dizzying mixture of infernal diseases that headed from east to west. But the Columbian theory states that syphilis was one of the few diseases we know of, at least, that went in the opposite direction. This idea was supported by the 538 skeletal remains found in the Dominican Republic that showed characteristics of treponemal disease in 6 to 14% of the affected population. Effects attributed to syphilis. These deaths occurred years before the first outbreak in Europe, with Columbus and his men returning to the Old World 3 years before the first outbreak in Naples in 1495. The pre-Columbian theory suggests that syphilis was always in Europe but was diagnosed as something else, perhaps leprosy, or that there were in fact different strains present, and the arrival of the intercontinental explorers back on European shores and the first major outbreak was just pure coincidence. There is actually some evidence for this theory as well, with skeletons from Pompeii and Metaponto in Italy found with damage similar to that caused by congenital syphilis, while 14th century skeletons found in Austria seemed to show the same thing. This is an argument that probably won. It was never fully answered and led to the proposal of a combination theory that suggested that both could be accurate and that a highly contagious version of the disease may have passed through the Bering Strait to the Americas thousands of years ago and never completely died out. So yes, perhaps Columbus and his own men brought something with them. But yes, something similar may have existed in Europe and Asia thousands of years ago as well. If there is any doubt about the final origin of syphilis, the first major outbreak was always clear in 1494. Amid the typical infighting between European leaders, Charles VII, King of France, invaded Italy with a force of about 25,000 men. They brought down the Italian boot with impressive speed and an equally blood-curdling savagery. In February 1495, the invading army reached the gates of Naples, where they entered unopposed, and as you can imagine, for a group of soldiers who had been on the move for months, the French celebrated with great enthusiasm, and the local brothels saw a booming trade. Charles VII was not particularly interested in staying for long. For a long time and soon turned to France, once again his men overwhelmed by the spoils of war, but also something altogether less desirable. In a matter of weeks after the fall of Naples, a mysterious disease began to spread through the French ranks, which began as genital ulcers that soon turned into skin rashes and muscle and joint pain. The French were engaged in a final battle on Italian soil, but with a significant number of people too weak to withstand the onslaught. They almost staggered without much of the loot stolen. In terms of spreading a disease, that you really may not have fared much better than soldiers returning from a military campaign, although they were certainly aware of this while returning to France. At this stage, almost nothing was known about this new disease, including how it spread when they returned home, and no doubt led them to much carnal exploitation. It spread like wildfire, and by the end of 1495 the disease had spread throughout France and parts of Germany and Switzerland. Considering how syphilis spread mainly through unprotected sex, and when we think of the amount of unprotected sex that was going on during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it is not difficult to see how this disease spread. It swept the world with breakneck speed in 1497. Much of England and Scotland were recording cases, and just 3 years later, in the 1500s, Scandinavia, Hungary, Greece, Poland, and Russia had been consumed by the epidemic. Syphilis had spread to every corner of Europe, and it seemed no place was free of the disease. But this was also a time of glorious exploration, when trade routes were being opened across the oceans and relationships were being forged with distant lands and their peoples. And once again, it was a glorious time of exploration. What better way to spread a highly infectious disease than through the horniness of sailors who, after weeks or months at sea, searched for the nearest brothel after disembarking, and thus transmitted syphilis from one continent to another with remarkable efficiency. So as I said right at the beginning of this video, this new disease did not immediately have a name. So different nations used this as a way to exercise their xenophobia. If you were not very fond of the Spanish at the time, then why not give their name to this raw groin disease, as the Dutch did now? Almost everyone did this, and it wasn't just restricted to nationalities, with the Turks referring to it, as we said, the Christian disease, and the Muslims further east placing the blame squarely on the Hindu population. The use of the disease in a derogatory way can be partially explained by the way the disease was transmitted by the sexual starvation of men, and prostitutes provided the intricate web that eventually spread around the world, and because of this, those suffering from the disease were typically stigmatized and seen as immoral and impure. One of the first neutral names used was smallpox, as a way to differentiate it from smallpox because it had similar symptoms, although smallpox was always much more deadly than syphilis, so the name did not really make much sense. We see the first mention of the word syphilis in a poem written by the Italian physician and poet Girolamo Fracastoro in 1530, entitled Syphilis of Morbus Gallicus. In it, a young shepherd boy with the unfortunate name of Syphilis becomes the first person on earth to contract this new disease that was sent by the god Apollo as punishment for his disobedience. There is nothing quite like the fear of eternal damnation to make you get your pants wet. This name was changed slightly when Fracastoro wrote a book on contagious diseases, and the name has remained ever since. While much of the mystery surrounding syphilis has remained, in the 16th century doctors had a good idea of how it was spreading, which led to attempted crackdowns on prostitution and sex outside marriage in many parts of Europe. Henry VIII, that shining beacon of monogamy, did his utmost to shut down the brothels and bathhouses in London, while in other countries, securities regulations surrounding prostitution were introduced, but often they were little more than dismissals of prostitutes who showed symptoms and completely turning a blind eye to the legions of men who spread the disease. It is worse to mention that at this early stage many remained completely against syphilis. Even being treated, some considered it as a divine punishment for sin and were more than happy to let God's messy work Clear heads emerged who saw this as part of their Hippocratic oath to treat all diseases without prejudice. While syphilis is still present today, its reputation as a wild and mysterious disease that causes nose loss has diminished considerably over the years. But for hundreds of years, people grumbled in the dark in search of anything that could help. Mercury, which had also been used for leprosy, was first used as a treatment for syphilis in 1496. This continued for centuries with more and more different methods of administration, from simply rubbing it on the patient's skin or drops in the mouth to the more complex fumigation he saw. The mercury vaporized and the resulting vapor sent to a small box where the patient patiently placed this product. It may sound like an oddly soothing Swedish sauna, but with side effects including loose teeth, this isn't something you should try anytime soon or ever. Another treatment that emerged in the 16th century was the use of the guacama plant native to the Caribbean that was brewed into a hot drink and consumed by patients. This had very little to do with any remarkable evidence and more with the fact that it came from the same place where syphilis was said to have come from, the Americas, and many believed that surely nature would provide a cure for such horror in the same place it originated from. But there was no cure for syphilis, and treatments often did little more than slow the disease down over time. However, the disease has lost some of its deadly edge, and in the 17th century syphilis became less virulent and less lethal, but it can still leave an unpleasant mark. As I mentioned earlier, it was common for certain facial features to seem to disappear as a result of disfigurement, and nasal collapse, as you can see, was not a beautiful sight. And you can imagine, it was not long before artificial noses were introduced in the 16th century saw some pioneering work in facial reconstruction using a method known as preflap, which was from the earliest known surgical examples of moving tissue from one part of the body to another. Until we reached the 20th century, syphilis was certainly a much lesser threat than in the previous 4 centuries, calculating. But a study from Britain that focused on the northern city of Chester in the 18th century found that about 8% of the population under the age of 35 contracted the disease. While in rural areas this figure was closer to 1% in the late 18th century, it was thought that approximately 1 in 5 Londoners had contracted syphilis by their mid-30s, who used commercial sex to support themselves financially or in situations that made them vulnerable to predation and sexual assault, such as domestic service in 1905. The German duo Fritz Chardin and Erich Hoffmann first identified Treponema pallidum, the organism that causes syphilis, and from there, things began to move quickly. The first effective treatment for syphilis asphyemia was discovered by Zachariah Harder in 1909 and was on the market a year after the discovery of penicillin. In 1928, it would be the biggest step in the fight against syphilis, but it was not until 1943 that successful tests were carried out in the USA. At the Staten Island Marine Hospital in New York, for 8 days, 4 patients were injected with penicillin at regular intervals, and, just like that, the first cure for syphilis arrived. But that was not the end. Far from it. As I mentioned earlier, syphilis still kills about 100,000 people a year, and this is certainly not restricted to the poorest and least developed nations. The United States and Europe still penicillin, when the disease had a mortality rate of about 10%. Over a 40-year period, despite there being a certified cure, this disease still cast a dark shadow in the second half of the 20th century. Although not in exactly the same way as before, the United States retains the dubious distinction of being caught not once but twice involved in some truly wicked activities involving syphilis. The Tuskegee study on untreated syphilis in the black man was a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 in which black men in the United States were told that they were being treated for bad blood, when in fact the purpose of the study was simply to track the progress of syphilis if it were not treated, and to remember that 10 years after the start of the study, penicillin was a certified cure for the disease, from which many in the study continued to suffer for years and presumably spread the disease to other people. But if you thought that was bad, the experimental study of syphilis in Guatemala really got you involved. Doctors purposely infected soldiers, prostitutes, prisoners, and mental patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases in Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, leading to at least 83 deaths. All this was financed by a donation from the USA. The rise in sexually transmitted infections in the United States has taken a particularly tragic turn. More than 3,700 cases of congenital syphilis were reported in 2022, about 11 times the number recorded a decade ago, according to data released Tuesday by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Syphilis during pregnancy can lead to miscarriage and stillbirth, and babies who survive can go blind or deaf, or have severe developmental delays. In 2022, the disease caused 231 stillbirths and 51 deaths of babies. Nearly 90% of new cases could have been prevented with timely testing and treatment, according to the agency. Syphilis in infants continues to increase, and the situation is critical, Laura Bachman, medical director of the agency's Division for the Prevention of Sexually Transmitted Diseases, said in an interview. We need to do things differently. One case is indicative of a failure in public health infrastructure, and now we have 3,700. The system fails in several ways. Nearly 38% of the 3,700 babies were born to women who did not receive prenatal care. Of the women who had at least one prenatal visit, 30% were never tested for syphilis or were tested too late. And, among those who tested positive, 88% received inadequate, undocumented, or no treatment at all. Public health departments used to have teams of disease intervention specialists and nurses to make sure pregnant women were tested and treated, even if it meant giving them injections in their homes, said Thomas Dobbs, director of the John D. Bauer School of Population Health at the University of Mississippi. But these departments were dismantled. You can't dismantle public health infrastructure and not expect bad things to happen, Dobbs said. I can't believe that we are in this state of health in a country as rich as ours. Calling the rise of congenital syphilis a shameful crisis and accelerated by funding cuts and bureaucratic hurdles, the National Coalition of STI Directors on Tuesday demanded $1 billion in federal funding and a syphilis response coordinator at the White House to stem the tide. Syphilis was almost eliminated in the U.S. 20 years ago, but increased by 74%, reaching 177,000 cases between 2017 and 2021. Other STIs are also on the rise. In 2021, there were 1.6 million cases of chlamydia and more than 700,000 cases of gonorrhea. In recent years, the reduction in routine preventive care, the increase in telemedicine for prenatal care, and the reduction in clinic hours may have aggravated the situation. If you're in an extremely poor state like Mississippi, where the working class is really struggling to survive, everything is a barrier, Dobbs said. Nationwide, about 1 in 5 pregnant women diagnosed with syphilis did not receive prenatal care, suggesting they were tested elsewhere, such as an emergency room, prison, or syringe exchange program. That proportion was higher in Michigan, where about a third of all STIs were diagnosed in emergency departments.